Okay, so welcome to the Dynamics GP Payables Management Basics class. It's the third in our series so far. We covered GL and now we're ready to launch into the AP section of GP 2013. My name is Tracy Tremblay. I lead the Dynamics GP practice here at Brittenford. I've been working with GP for about 15 years. I was a user prior to starting doing support on GP. I have about 20 years experience in all aspects of the accounting department. I'm a CPA and I am a certified Dynamics GP consultant, master certified. So anxious to show you what you can do with accounts payable. What we're going to cover today in the basics class is we're going to add and edit vendor information. We're going to enter new vouchers and adjustments. We are going to select vouchers for payment, print and void checks. We're going to enter some manual payments and perform some key inquiries and print some key reports. In addition, what I always like to do is throw in some tips and tricks based on what I have learned or learned from clients as to some tips and tricks on more efficiencies and cool things in GP. So first, what I always like to cover is some systems navigational tips on the GP screen. What I've selected here that you're looking at is the purchasing window within GP. When you first log into GP, what you always see is this is called the home screen. And if I'm working in purchasing, what I like to do is click on the purchasing tab, and what that does is allows me to see all of the sub windows within the purchasing environment and all the different things that we can do. This window within here with your transactions, cards, reports, etc. is the same as if I were to access these through the top menu items. Previously, before the purchasing window or the sales or financial window, the only option was to access through the menu screens above, and some people, even though we have done enhancements, still prefer to access the windows through the menu screens, so you can do that as well. So if I go to transactions and purchasing, I get all these menu options here, and these are the same options that I have in my transaction window here. So just to give you some perspective on the navigational differences between the menus at the top and the window that you're looking at for each module. Where we're going to start today is adding and editing vendor information. Vendors are added through the vendor cards. We would start here with going to cards and vendor, and we're going to go ahead and open that up here by clicking on it. This opens a vendor maintenance window. As you can see on my window, what I've done in my preferences is I've set it so that my required information is illustrated in red. so that I know immediately what information is required. And yes, for the setting up a vendor, you have two requirements. One is a vendor ID, and the other is a name. You don't have to fill out any of this other information. You'll want to, but you don't have to. So if instead of setting up a new vendor, I'm going to go ahead and pull up an existing one. Okay, so this has a vendor ID. You can come up with whatever naming convention works for your organization. A lot of people like to use alpha and numeric mixed. Some like to use all numeric for searching capabilities and ease of finding your vendors. Often it's a lot of people like to use the alphanumeric naming convention as opposed to just naming. But if you do use numeric, I'll give you some tips on how to search for those vendors and still find them, even though the numbering may not be intuitive. So then I'm going to add a name. The short name is just another quick version of the name, and I can search by the short name as well. And then the check name is what is going to show up on the check when it's printed, and this can be different than your vendor name. If you've got say a consultant who came up with a company name and that's what they invoice under, but they're a private consultant and want the checks made out to themselves, then you can print that. You can print it, put a different name here on the check name, or maybe they have an extended name that needs to be on the check, then you can put that here. Status is always active. If I'm no longer using this vendor, then I can have the option of setting up as inactive or temporary. Temporary vendors, just so you know, are ones that maybe I'm just going to pay one time. As soon as I pay them, I can actually delete that vendor, remove that vendor from the history. The transactions still stay, but I'm not clogging up my vendor list. If you've got temporary helpers over the summer that, do some work for a week or a month, and you just want to get them in, pay them, but then not continue to have all these transient workers in your vendor list, then you can set them up as temporary, and at the end of the year, then they get flushed out. So it's a good way to keep your vendor listing under control. Address IDs. I can set up address IDs for the company, which may be your primary ID. Where these also come in handy is down here where we use our address IDs. If I had a different purchasing, if I'm using purchase orders or something like that, I can set up 3 different types of remit to purchasing and ship from address IDs, so that when I'm creating a purchase order or something, then I can have a different ID than where the check goes to. And if I set them up as a 1099 vendor, I can also have a 1099 address. And this is actually new in GP 2013 for those of you who are using other versions of the software. So I can set up, you can name these whatever you want. It doesn't have to be primary. You can call it main. You can call whatever makes the most sense to you. If I click on this magnifier right here, the lookup, that will show me what other addresses are in here. I can click on the remit to and see how that address may be different. So this is box 342. That's where we're sending the checks to, but the actual company is on 123 Riley Street. Okay. This icon right here, in case you were wondering, takes us to Google Maps, and it actually shows where the company is located. Class ID, oftentimes what people like to do is set up classes for their vendors. This allows us to have consistent information, for example, on your accounts and your options, which we'll get to in a moment. And you can push the information through at a global level if you want to make a change. So if I want to change an accounts payable or an expense account for these vendors in this class, or if I have some 1099 changes, then I can make that at a class level and push it down. So we'll get to that in a moment. Just want to explain why we see that here on the screen, what Class ID stands for. If we've got certain tax schedules set up for the vendor, then we would select that here. This is not a required field, so if you don't require tax information or calculations, then you don't have to change anything. So these are your available tax windows where you're going to set up different tax rates for different types of purchases. Shipping methods can be set up here as well. So you've got them if you're actually sending anything to these vendors, then you can select the way that things get shipped. Let's go into options. These are the options that get set up for each vendor. They can be, again, the same for each class ID. If I had 1099 vendors or overseas vendors or utility vendors, if I wanted to set something different for each one, then I can do that. We can set default checkbook IDs. I can put tax information here. Obviously, this was created before the new W-9 1099 rules, where we have to have a tax ID for each vendor, but this is where you would enter that information. For my minimum payments, if I've got a minimum payment that we can make to this vendor, then I can put in that in here, maximum invoice amount. If I have a maximum invoice amount for a vendor, then I can put it in here, and that protects you when someone's in your AP department is trying to enter vendor invoices, that it won't go over that amount. Not a wildly used field, but it's good to have if you have controls like that. Credit limits. If there's a credit limit as to how much you can record for a vendor, then you can put that amount in here by selecting this right here and putting in the amount. Say I wanted this to be $2,500. Sorry. Then I can put in $2,500 here. I can do unlimited, and I can do no credit at all. We're saying this has a credit limit of unlimited. If it was not unlimited and I tried to enter an invoice over a certain amount, then I would get an error message saying that this was over the credit limit. Write-offs, not allowed, unlimited or maximum. This is only important if you want to do a write-off. Let's say we got an invoice in for $10,001 and we paid $10,000 because the maximum we were going to pay was $10,000, and we have this $1 sitting on the account that we want to write off. As long as this says not allowed, it will not let you even write that dollar off. This would have to be changed to either unlimited or maximum. So we're not covering the write-off process today, but just so you understand what the write-off field means is if you go to do write-offs, this box would have to be set to allow that. It can always be changed later, and oftentimes people will do that because it keeps AP clerks or your AP department from randomly just writing things off. It becomes more of a process that everyone gets involved in and approves and everything like that. So payables discount, this is where your write-offs post to. So your revaluing of your vendors if you use multi-currency works here. Your maintaining of your history, the default is for all of these to be selected. You want to save it for the calendar year, the fiscal year, the transaction year, and the distribution. If you don't want to save your distribution history, you can uncheck this. Usually this decision is based on how much space you have in your databases and how much information you want to hold going backwards. Looking at our address button down here, this is going to look very similar to the address that we had, that we clicked on when we viewed this briefly. Again, I can set up more than one address ID. Here I have a remit to and a primary. I put in phone information. Again, the only two required fields are these ones in the red. This is also where we would record if we're using EFT payments, where I would record my EFT bank information for this vendor. Accounts shows what GL default accounts when I process a transaction against this vendor. These are the accounts that are going to default on my distributions based on these types of transactions. They're always changeable, and we can change them on a transaction by transaction basis, but this is what will default with any given transaction. For purchases, sometimes you have more than one choice. It may be more than just travel, service, and installation. Maybe I want travel and flights or hotels. Then I can do that here as well. If I click on these buttons, Here, it allows me to add additional accounts instead of just the one default for purchasing. So it gives you a little more flexibility. There is an email tab. If you're using GP10 or GP2010, you will not have this button. Your email information is going to be on the address tab in here, and it's going to have an I for internet information, and you would put your email addresses in there. Okay, we don't have any emails in here. What we're also doing here is we're saying if we do an EFT remittance for this vendor, this one's not set up for it, but if we do, then this is the document that we're going to use to send them, telling them that we've made a payment and done a remittance. And then project is a whole new series. It's a whole new other program that if we're using project accounting, then we would set these up. So we can go ahead and save this. I can go ahead and print it, and I can add attachments here if I have this workflow set up. Okay. Okay. If I want to change the information, it's as simple as opening that card back up and changing the information. So not sure if there's any additional information on setting up. Oh, one thing we did not go over, and I think that's important. I believe Mr. Beaumont is a 1099 vendor. So I just want to show you real quick where we set up that 1099 information. Let me go back one screen. You open up your vendor information, or if you're first setting it up, you can see that this is a 1099 vendor because he's got a 1099 address ID set down here under the address IDs. So we would be sending, in this case, we're sending everything to the same location. To indicate that he's a 1099 vendor, I'm going to hit on options, and I put in a tax type of miscellaneous. This default says not a 1099 vendor, but then I can set him up as a dividend, interest, or miscellaneous 1099 vendor, and then indicate the box that this transaction would fall into. Okay, typically it's non-employee compensation, but you may have other types of 1099 vendors. If you have additional information that you want to track, we have some flexibility. This type line right here and the user-defined to right here are both user-defined fields. In this case, we set this one up as type, and if I wanted to track additional information for this vendor, then I can type it in right here. User-defined to, sometimes what we use this field for is, I'll set this up for clients to help them track whether we've received the W-9 or not. And then what they can do is say yes or no in this file sometimes, or in this field. And it's also searchable by Smart List, and we can add that to reports as well. So it's not that you're just putting it on the card and having it and then having to look at each card. You can add that field to a Smart List report and actually run queries on it. So super useful if you can think of some other ways that you could track information or information that you wish you had on a vendor that distinguishes them. That's one way to do it. If you're curious where you would go to make that change, you would go to your setups window under Payables. We'd look at options, and here's where we see the user-defined 1 and the user-defined 2. You can see that this one, user-defined 1, was changed to type, and user-defined 2 is still user-defined 2. So if I were to go in here right now and call this W9 received, and we'll even help them. Trying to fit as much information as possible here. So here I can say W9 filed, yes or no. I can say OK. I can say OK here. So now I've changed that user-defined field to. Sometimes it takes a second to refresh, but I can go back into my vendor card. Let's pull up Mr. Beaumont because we know he's a 1099 and we know he had a tax ID. We'll go here to options, and now we can see that we've changed this to W9 filed yes or no. And we'll say yes because I'm pretty sure I've collected it. Okay, so I've changed that, and now I can query on that. So when we get to running some queries, then I'll pull that up and show you how that works. Addresses we covered. This is the same. This is just another way to get to this this field right here. I can add addresses without going into the vendor card. So if I open that up, it's the same as, and then you have the options here. It's the same as accessing it through the vendor card. If I want to get summary information on a vendor, then I can look at this window here. The last check number that we cut them was this check with a date of 2/15, and it was an amount of $50. They have a current balance of $6,713.27 that we owe them. This was their highest balance ever. The first time they purchased from us was 2013. Okay. I can look at it from on a period by period basis. I can also look at 1099 amounts in here. And I can look at an annual and get some information on here. And this is the amount since the last close. So if you close your AP calendar year, if your year ends in December and you're not closing your year until March, then that will affect the numbers that you see in here. 1099 details allows you to see the 1099 information. This is also where I can go to change. Now, as you see here, it only pulls up my 1099 vendors, which is really nice. If I have someone that I forgot to label as a 1099 vendor and now they are a 1099 vendor, we can certainly go in and change them on that vendor screen, and they will either be added or removed from this list. And I can also go in and change which invoices after the fact, just to true up our 1099s. So if I look at this by the year, okay, we have none for so not looking like we have any transactions. But if I wanted to edit these, you edit them by period, and I can just go in and change this amount right here, and that changes the 1099. So when you get to that point in your year, usually January, February, January time frame, and you're truing up your 1099s, that's how you would change that information. Customer vendors, if I had customer vendors, and this is typically created for your AR customers that you owe a refund to, they would become a customer vendor, and then we can cut them a refund check from the sales module, and if they had an overpayment or a dispute or something like that. So we have a question on what is the fastest way to print all of your vendors. I can look at vendors here, what I typically like to do, and we haven't gotten into SmartList, but SmartList is one of my favorite tools in GP, is I would go to purchasing, I would go here to vendors, and you can see these ones here with the asterisks next to them are default ones. These are the ones that are just set up in GP independently. So this gives me a list, vendor ID, vendor name, address, information for all my vendors. I can go in and restrict, and I don't know what your experience out there is with SmartList. If you haven't used them, they're a super powerful tool. I can add restrictions to this vendor inquiry. So I have 111 vendors set up here. This maximum records field here on the search options cuts me off at 1,000 if I know I have more than 1,000 vendors, because I've never, ever gotten rid of any of my vendors. I've never inactivated them. They're just all there, and I think, you know, let's say I have 30,000 vendors. I can pump this number up to 250,000. Hopefully I never see 250,000 vendors, but I can switch that up. I can also restrict this to, and I have the option of these selected columns is just the ones in my query here. I can go to all columns and what I'm looking for is active. Remember that field that we just added, the user-defined field? It's right here. I wanted to select here vendor status is equal to active. So let's say out of these 111 vendors, I only want to see the active, or maybe I want to see how many I have that are inactive or temporary. Without this restriction, I see all of them. So I had 7 vendors because now I have a list of 104. The other option is to add some columns, and I can put that same vendor status right on here, and I would want that to be at the beginning, so I move it up. That way I get the vendor status. And then just because I added it and I want to see it, let's say I want to see that new field that I just added. I'm going to go ahead and add that to my report at the end so I can see who I've received W-9s for. So this tells me right here, here's the one that I received the W-9 for. These are all my active vendors. The beautiful thing is I can look here and say, okay, I've only received a W-9 for one vendor, but I know that I also got a W-9 for Angela. So I can click on Angela right here, open up her card. I can go to options, and I can type yes right here. I can say OK. I can close this window and save it. I can refresh my data. I still have 104, and now I have 2 yeses. So I can make the changes right off the fly if I see something that's not correct, or if I need want a little more information. So your question was print. I can print. From here, I can export to Excel as well. I could also use this to create a letter to my vendor. Let's say I really need these W-9s and I have only gotten 2 of them. Then I can generate a Word letter right from this screen, and it's a mail merge letter that sends out to all these vendors saying we need your 1099. So hopefully that answered your question. That is how I would do it. Okay. So that was the information I have for editing and entering vendors. If you have any questions or there was something you were hoping to know that hasn't been addressed, let me know and we'll circle back. But we're going to go ahead and move on to transactions. Now this section up at the top, if you're registered for this module, this is purchase orders. That's not what we'll be covering today in the AP Basics, but we're going to scroll down here into this section for transaction entry, manual payments, and selecting checks. So the first thing you start with when you get an invoice in is you enter that invoice into the Payables module. You do that through the transaction entry screen. So your voucher number is a GP assigned unique identifier. for the AP transaction, automatically numbered based on your setup. It takes, once you enter a voucher, this automatically advances to the next number. My recommendation would be to make it so this can't be changed. If this is an editable field, which in this case it is, if I make this a smaller number that happens to be available, then if I make it a smaller of a number than what is here, sometimes what happens is it locks up your window, and the next person who goes in will try and use the next number that may have been used, and you'll get an error message saying that the voucher number is not available. And then we have to go in and figure out what the next number should have been. And so anyways, to avoid messes, I recommend in your setup, and I'll just show you real quick, in your setup that you do not want to be able to override the voucher number at transaction entry. Again, where I found that was Payables setup here, and you may or may not have access to this window based on your security rights, but your SA can certainly change this. If I uncheck this, then I can no longer change that window. So let's close that and open it again. And as you can see, I can no longer change this field. So it just keeps everything unique and keeps you from running into error messages. So I can pull up one of these transactions that's already been entered just to walk through what we're looking at. This is for Mr. Bergeron, or Bergeron Communications. I put in that this is an invoice. My other options are credit memos and returns. Typically, invoices and credit memos are the main types of transactions that you'll enter. I'll set up a payables batch. The reason I set up a batch when entering transactions is so that I can save them, and so that I can print off edit lists and do, submit for approval and get the whole batch processed at the same time. Description is a description of the transaction. In this case, they put PM. If I'm going to make that something a little bit more descriptive, this is communications, so I'm going to say that this is my April telco invoice. Okay, this description is what's going to show up on my reports. It's what's going to show up when I do an inquiry, and I want this to be as helpful. I'll even say April 2017 telco invoice. While I say I want it to be as descriptive as possible, I am limited by the amount of space in here. If I really have something additional and important to say, I can always go to this little window right here. This is called a notes window. I can open this up and put additional information, and I can put a lot of information. I can fill this whole box, and you can see it scrolls all the way down. I attach this here. So let's say I want to say, okay, so that I understand when I look back at this invoice and my next month is twice as much, then I'll say, oh, okay, now I know why this one was so small without having to actually pull it out. I can actually, as you can see, we can even attach a copy of the invoice or additional information by clicking on this button or on the paperclip. So I can see whenever I look at this transaction forever and always. And these can also be added after the fact. You can add notes right here. Just always remember to do it next to your voucher number and not at the bottom of your window. This is called a window note, which means it's attached to the payables transaction entry window, and every transaction I pull up will have that same note. If I put the note here instead of here. This one attaches it to the specific voucher. This attaches it to the window. I've added this payables batch as my batch ID. Some people like to add the batch beforehand. Some like to add the batch afterwards. I tend to do my batches on the fly. So when I enter this in here, if the batch does not exist, then it's going to pop up a window saying, do you want to add this batch? And that's where I'll say yes. I'll circle back to batches after I finish this because there's a couple things I'll explain about that. So I've added my description. I've chosen my vendor ID. Again, the only three things that are required for this are my voucher number, my vendor ID, and a document number. So in this case, we're calling it document 2. I've got a primary address ID. I've got no remit to address ID as a default for this. So I'm going to go ahead and add my remit to ID as the primary so that when we send the check that it actually comes out with an address on it. Otherwise, you'll be using a label or handwriting it or sticking it in an envelope. Payment terms, let me know what the expectation is as to when I have to pay this based on the document date of 4/21. So if this document date was 4/21 and my actual date is 5/23, as it is, then, and this is net 30, this is due in 2 days. So it's not 30 days from the day I'm entering it, it's 30 days from the date of the invoice. And I can change these. I can say net 30, we have end of month, COD, we can get a discount, and these are all, typically set up as defaults in your system for you to choose. So I put in my purchase amount of $75. And for this particular vendor, they're a 1099 vendor. If they are a 1099 vendor, and then this will automatically default over here as the amount of the invoice. Let's say that part of this was a reimbursement for travel, maybe not for Bergeron Communications, but for another vendor. I can actually change this to $50. And if I want to on the fly say, yes, I know that they're a miscellaneous and non-employee compensation 1099, but this one's different. I want it to show up in a different box. On their 1099 at the end of the year, I can actually change it right here as I'm going along, and it saves me adjustments at the end of the year. So we have the option of managing these throughout the year as we're entering them, or we can always go back at the end of the year and do some reconciliations. Okay, the distributions are required before it will allow me to save this transaction. If we use these double arrow expansions right here, we can always see what type of account this charge is going to. In this case, it's contract services, so maybe they set something up for us. And then you'll always have accounts payable showing up on here as well. Unless, let's say, I've already paid him when he showed up at the door and I gave him $75 cash. I can go ahead and put that payment right here. And we're calling it cash with a payment number of, and this is an automatically generated number as well. Paid it out of that checkbook, which it will show as a withdrawal. I can put in the check. If I put in check information, then I would actually put a check number. If I actually, physically wrote him a check right out of the checkbook, or maybe I paid it online through the banking system, any of those would make it happen. But as you can see, if I go to the distribution now, hang on, I think I need to, okay, so it doesn't like my distributions, and it doesn't like my distributions. Because I've actually put cash. So I can add cash to here. And I'm using the cash operating account. And then the payables account again. I forgot this one. Okay, so now it likes my distributions. I've hit my cash account. I've put it in and out of payables, and I hit my expense account on my distributions. So I can save this transaction, and it advances to the next. I don't have to open and close this window every time if I'm adding this to the same payables batch, or I can type over this and start a new batch. Typically, what most clients like to do is add all the invoices for the day into one batch and then send it off for approval. I can get my batch edit list, which tells me everything that I've entered, by clicking on the window within the payables transaction entry, or I can go to the batch window. What this is going to show me is all the transactions and whether they've got errors in them. Someone entered this voucher before us, and it's telling us that it contains errors and won't be posted, so this would have to be corrected. This is another reason why I always like to save things to a batch, because I have the opportunity to review them. Typically what happens is this will go to your manager and they'll review, making sure that you're posting to the correct that they're going to the correct GL accounts prior to posting, because this transaction will either post through the GL or post to the GL and then let someone in accounting post it through the GL. So you have the option to set it up either way. So the problem with this one is that the vendor must be submitted for approval first. These guys are set up for workflows, which is a whole nother beast, as it were. Our vendor here, Bergeron, that we just worked with, they're already approved. We can see our distributions here. Okay, and we can see the transactions. And here's another vendor, Tim, who submitted an expense report. Okay. This vendor also must be submitted for approval first prior to this transaction being processed. So that's what an edit list tells you. Again, I can print it from my payables entry window when I've entered my last invoice, or I can go down here to the bottom to batches. And I can pull my batch up here. And I can get the same report. Okay. So what I would like to do is I would like to go back to our, he's already. I would like to go back to the transaction that we just entered here. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this payment, which is going to make me want to remove the distribution as well. And for those of you who are wondering how you get rid of those lines, that was how we do it. We'll highlight the line and then you can go to Edit, Delete Row. It's super hard to just try it. You get errors when you try and just remove the amount and remove the account. And you go through that back and forth. Well, that's how you remove it. You go to Delete Row under Edit. What I want to do here is I want to post this, because what we're going to do is now we're going to take this same transaction that we are familiar with and we're going to go ahead and pay it. So in that case, I'm going to go ahead and remove this from the batch. And it's as simple as just removing the batch ID here. I could also go in here, and if I had another payables transaction batch, then I could go ahead and, so this isn't going to let me post. We're not allowed to post from here. Let's go ahead and put this back in the batch and save it, and we'll just pay someone else. So to pay checks, and again, if there was something you wanted to know about entering an AP transaction, let me know and we can circle back to that. I'm going to go ahead and move on to making paying the invoices that are out there to be paid. There's two different ways that I've seen people do this, and it's entirely up to you as to which makes you comfortable. I like to start here at select checks and then build my batch. I know other folks who like to go down here to batches and create their batch. This tells you here what types of batches are out there. You can see computer check 1, computer check 2. I'm not sure what's in there, but we have this origin, so we're going to call this so that we can find our check batch. And then we're going to go to this origin. Now, if you are the type of person who likes to add their batch first, then you create your batch name, and then you can say Payables transaction entry, which takes you right to the Payables transaction window. Computer check will take you to the computer check select window, and then you've got your manual payment, which takes you to the manual payment window. So we're doing computer checks, and like I said, there are people who prefer to create the batch first and then select the checks, and then there's others like myself that prefer to go to select checks first. We've gone ahead and created this batch in advance. So payment method would be check. If you've got EFT set up and you want to do an EFT batch, it's done in the exact same place as you do your check batches. You just select EFT, and then after you go through your payment selection, which vendors you want to pay, things get different, but up to this point, you're just doing your check selection here. We're going to go ahead and select a checkbook. And we'll go ahead and select Uptown Trust. I think that's the default one. And then we can go here to transactions. And it says, what do you want to do? Select payables checks, edit payables checks. We're going to go ahead and do select checks for here. I'm going to show you how to get to that same place by going here. We open the select checks, and then we are going to choose the batch that we built. So from here, and in GP 2013, for those of you who are on older versions, we have a lot more flexibility for our parameters for selecting vendors to pay. Previously, you could select by vendor ID and I believe it's document number or voucher number, if you know specifically. But now I can just pay a class of vendors. I can select a vendor name or a range of vendors. I can do payment priority, and payment priority is if I'm tight on money, then I can rank my vendors as a payment priority 1, 2, or 3, so that ones being who I have to pay first, second is leftovers, and third is if I have a lot of money in my bank account. So if you're tight on money, that's one way of helping you to determine who gets paid first. You can actually just number them. I can choose my voucher number or a range of voucher numbers, document number, payment number, and due date. So if I only want to choose vendors who have a payment due date of next week, then I can select this and then say due date is. So in this case, I'm on a system date of 4/12. So this is saying, do you want them only due through today? And I might say something like, no, show me everyone who's due through the end of the month. And then it would only pick the vendors with a calculated invoice due date, or invoices with a calculated due date of 4/30. In order to make that stick when I'm building the batch, I would hit insert. I'm not going to do that today because I don't think I have that many invoices entered that it would choose that. I can choose one check per vendor or one check per invoice. The default is one check per vendor, and it will pull all invoices due for that vendor. I can automatically apply unapplied payments, credit memos, and returns, so that if I have credit memos sitting on the account, it's going to apply that to the vendor first, to the next available invoice, and only pay the amount due. The apply date is today because that's the date that I'm paying it. And I can choose whether to list all my documents, how they're applied, totals only, invoices only, and I can sort my documents. So printing previously applied documents shows, ones that we've paid previously. So once I get this all set, my window all set, and my selections all made, then I can go here to build a batch. And because I had no restrictions, it's going to pull everything that's available for me. And I should come up with a batch total. So some of my available, and I'll know in a second. Okay, so we've chosen to pay $1,297,000. Maybe I didn't know that I had that much outstanding, so what I want to do is go to edit my check batch, because I'm thinking I don't have $1 million to pay at the moment. So I probably want to go in and remove some of these from my payment list. So I'm going to go in here to edit my check batch, and I can scroll through and see everyone that I'm trying to pay. I should have someone super large in here to come up with $1 million. But I think we just owe a lot of people a lot of money. So maybe we, in this case, they're just paying them once a year. Gives you kind of an indication before you pay these checks how much money you have. So I really only have $65,000, assuming this is reconciled. I only have $65,000 in my bank account. I really can't afford to pay almost $1.3 million. So I'm going to start removing some of these from the list. Let's say advance is super important to me, but you know what? I'm pretty sure these ones are old, way back here. So I can actually go, I have two options here for removing advanced. I can remove the entire vendor from the list, and this goes to 0, or I can say, you know what, I know I need to pay them something, and then this tells me what invoices for advance that this is paying. And I can say, I'm going to pay just these 2 from this year because I think these ones are super old. So I can uncheck each one of these from the list, and now I'm only paying them $194 instead of $74,000. You know, I want to do the same for this guy. This is a super old one too, so I'm going to go ahead and remove him. Let's see, American. So I can do this for each one. Again, this is 2014, so I'm not going to pay them. And I can go on and on. We're going to go ahead and just remove all these guys from the list. And yes, unfortunately, there is no mass uncheck without deleting the batch. So we're down to $300,000. Going out the door, I think in a minute we'll be down to about $20,000. But this is how you go in and you edit your batch. If I wanted to make a partial payment to one of these guys, I can do that as well. Let's say I'm disputing this transaction. Here, let's go to this one, and I want to edit this check. Let's say I'm only going to pay $100 because we've negotiated. I think he overcharged me. So I can go in so this is what's going to print on the check stub. I can go to the apply information, and I can find that $141 here, and I can say I'm not going to pay him $141. I'm going to change this to $100 right here. Now it's going to want to know what I'm doing with the other money. I can write it off, I can put it as a discount, or I can just leave that open. So I can write this off right here in this amount right here if I know that this client is set up for write-offs, which at the moment I don't. I could actually look over here at the vendor card, but we're going to just leave it as $100. We'll say okay. We've changed the amount from 190 to 150. So we'll save that and close it. And now we're paying him $150 as opposed to $300. We removed a couple of the old transactions, so now I'm down to $344. I have two options here. I can go ahead and print the checks. If I need my batch approved prior to printing of the checks, which a lot of folks do, I can say okay here. I can close it, and I can go back to my batch. And I can print this for someone to review and approve and say that they agree. Maybe they wanted me to pay someone additional. So this says who we're paying and which invoices we're paying and for how much. Okay. So I'll submit this for sign off, get approval, and then I can go back in and I can print my checks. So I'll print my checks from this window right here, which is under transactions. I can go to print checks. I can also, and some people prefer to do it this way, gets you to the same place. I can go here to transactions and choose print checks here. Like I said, same difference. Oh. In this case, we've got workflows on, so they would have to be submitted for approval before we can print those. You probably will not have workflows set up in your area. What we do here is it's going to pull up, once this is processed and ready to go, it's going to pull up the checkbook here. It's going to pull the next check number and populate that here. If that check number is not my check number, then this is an editable field, and I would want to change the check number to what my next check number is. If you've got reconciling, concerns, like why is the system telling me that my last check number was 12345 and the one in my checkbook is 12347, then you'll want to deal with that. But as far as the system is concerned, it's going with the next available check number here. I would then go to process, and it would go ahead and print my checks. I can print first an alignment form. I know for me, when I would have to print checks, it wasn't my main function, but I would fill in when people weren't available. It would probably take me 6 or 7 times to get the check in the printer properly. So by printing an alignment form, you can do that on blank paper and make sure, if you're not familiar with the printer, or you got a new printer, or it's not your normal job, then you can do an alignment form and make sure you've got the check in frontwards and forwards and just the right configuration for that specific printer. Maybe yours prints upside down or instead of right side up. So I can do the alignment form. That will not change the check number. Or if I'm confident and I do this every week, or it is my main job and I'm familiar with the printer and nothing's changed, and I'm sure that my checks are in there, and it's a dedicated printer and no one's going to print a report over it, then I will pick checks. There are options. Okay, it's not even going to let me check that. There are different options for check formats. There's stub on top and bottom, and other different options. You'll have yours set up with your checkbook, and we'll have tested it before you get to this point. But so I apologize for not being able to actually hit process on this, but I would have to get my batch approved. What we can actually do, let's check to see if we have a batch out there that actually was approved through the workflow. So this one is one that was set up previously. It's not the one that we selected. This is a batch total for $990.89 that was set up without a workflow activated. It's pulling off of the Uptown Trust, which was the same account that we were going to use. It's got a next check number 20058 that's pulling from the checkbook, saying this is the next one that I have available. We've got stub on top, and we're going to go ahead and print our check. So I can go here to print, and I'm going to print it to the screen because if I send it to a printer, you won't be able to see it. Sometimes even if I want to see the check, I'll print it to the screen anyways because I can still send it to the printer from here. This window is always going to pop up for you. We're not ready to do anything with that right now, so we're going to go ahead and minimize it. So this is what my check looks like without the actual check backdrop. It's going to give me my vendor ID, my vendor name, some payment information. This is probably the check number. No. This is probably the check number. Okay. This is the payment number and then the check date, which is, in this case, today. I've got an amount. I've got a total for what we paid. Okay, and we just had one check in this batch. I have the address information for the vendor, the amount in words, and then over here the amount in numeric. Okay, and that is what it's going to look like when it prints out. In this case, we'll just close it. We're going to assume that it printed properly on the check paper. The reason I minimize this part, this window that popped up here prior to posting, is because if, in fact, due to my unfamiliarity with my printer, that I actually put the paper in upside down or backwards or whatever, and I just ruined yet another check, then I have the option here of reprinting prior to posting. Now, if I post this and then realize that I've printed the check upside down, or someone ran a report in my hesitation of hitting print because we're sharing a printer and their report printed on my check, or whatever the issue may be, then I can go here and I can say, go ahead and reprint my check or my checks. I can do the whole range of checks. If I put them in the wrong order and the front was actually the back, then I can reprint them, or I can void them all and start everything over. So let's say I want to reprint the checks. It comes up saying your next starting check number is 20059. So my last check was supposed to print as 20058. If 20058 is still a valid check number and I want to reuse it, I can change this back to 20058 and have it reprint as 20058. If I choose 20059, it will automatically void 20058 and reprint as 20059. So as it turns out, my check printed just fine. I'm happy with it, so I'm going to go ahead and process this posting, and I get all these lovely reports for my records and a check register and a checkbook posting. So I'm getting all these reports to validate what I've just done. This is going ahead and processing my check, and then I get all my reports. Okay, so you can print them off, you can cancel them, you can do whatever your process and policy requires you to do with them. If you don't want all those reports, every time you print a check, there is a way we can turn those off. Okay, so let's say, so that was it on printing the checks. So again, as throughout the class, if there's something you wanted to know that wasn't covered, just let me know and we'll circle back. If I now find out that we were not supposed to pay that invoice, we send it off for signature and someone decides that there's something wrong with it, or even if this happens weeks down the road or months down the road, that the check was never cashed or the client lost it or never received it and they want us to reissue it, then we would go in and void the check. Then you would go into void historical transactions and you would find that check number, which we know it's going to be the latest voucher number. Should be the latest voucher number. Which it is not. So we would have to know the voucher number. We would go ahead and I think 200. This was our document number 20058. 99089, we're going to go ahead and select that. And it's the only one here. We'll go ahead and select this, and then we would say void. This voids it in the checkbook, it voids it within Payables, and it creates an entry to be posted on the GL that has the exact reverse distribution as the transaction when you entered it. This here is a new feature in GP 2013, this reconcile button, and it allows you to actually see if this transaction has been cleared in the checkbook. So previously that wasn't available. So it's telling me reconciled is no, which is good to know, especially if they've called me and told me that they never got the check. Then I can see right here, without having to do a lot of digging, that at least it hasn't cleared the bank. Okay, so we're not going to void this because none of those situations apply, but okay. So that is voiding a check that we said we would walk through. Entering manual payments. So when would you want to enter a manual payment? And we're going to scroll back up here to the top. Here, top of the transaction part. Entering a manual payment might be if you have done a wire for the for this particular vendor, if you paid COD when they came to the door, If you're just doing a transaction on the fly, if you paid them through an automatic payment through your bank account, which we do have some clients who do, then you're going to go ahead and enter a manual payment. Let's see if we have one out here that hasn't been posted yet that we can kind of walk through. The date on this transaction is 4/21/17. Payment number, again, is automatically generated. We've put this in a batch so that we can save it, but we can certainly post it on the fly as we're creating this transaction. We're going to choose a vendor ID, and in this case, we're putting in a check. So maybe we wrote a check out of our physical checkbook, for those of you that actually have one, and it was $25. I can put a comment in as to why I'm writing this check. Again, I can always add a note here too, if I wanted to, because, you know, maybe a month or a year when we're doing audit season, I've completely forgotten why I would have written a manual check to this person. I can put additional information in here just to jog my memory. Certainly you can pull out the document if you're that organized to put all the information together. I like to put information in the notes section just because it saves me from having to dig everything out of the file cabinets or the vendor file. So I'm putting in a document number, I'm entering an amount. I'm going to go ahead and apply this to an invoice that's already outstanding. So at the moment we owe them $11,000, but we're going to pay $25 of that. I'm thinking that probably this was a different type of invoice that we may want to create. I can also create the expense right here as well on the distributions. From here, I can create an edit list. Okay, so this goes ahead and automatically records this as a payment if I'm applying it to the invoice right now. If I'm applying it to the invoice right now, if it's in there, then it takes care of the entire transaction. Otherwise, I can go and apply it to an invoice later. I'm just trying to record the transaction to the checkbook, and then I can go ahead and post it. I can post it from here if it's not part of a batch. If it is part of a batch, which in this case it is, then I can go here to batches, pull up my manual payment batch. Oh, that was the other one. No, it was that one. So there's two payments in there, and I can go ahead and post it from here. Okay, so that gets your transactions recorded in the checkbook. It gets it in Payables and opens it up to apply to outstanding invoices. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is some key inquiries and key reports that will make your job easier and answer questions for people within your organization or vendors who call up and ask for information as well. So we finished with what we're going to cover in this class. For the transaction section, if you want to know more, we are going to cover more in the advanced AP in June. We're going to flip down here to the inquiry screen, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these reports, specifically the trial balance. So if I want information on vendor transactions, I can go to transaction by vendor or transaction by document. I can get to transaction by document by going through vendor. So for me, I know that it's just easier to start with transaction by vendor, and then I can drill through to the document. For those of you that may be a little less aware or familiar with GP in general, anytime you see one of these blue fields, you can drill back into the system to get more information. So that's always useful. We're going to start with ACE, a travel company. And look at all the transactions that we've processed for them over time. We have invoices, we have payments. If we had credit memos, you'd see a CRM. I can also look at a little more information by hitting these double down arrows, not errors. It gives me a little more information, the due date of the transaction, a little bit more of that transaction description. Again, this here, just so you know how important it is when you're entering invoices. When I was back at my transaction entry and I'm entering a description right here, this is the description that is going to show up right here. And the more descriptive this is, given my limited space, the more descriptive this is, the less likely I'm going to have to keep going back to the vendor file or anything else. If I wanted to see a little more information on this, the distribution or something like that, I can go here to document. And it pulls up that same payables transaction entry screen that I saw earlier, or where I input everything, so I can get a little more information. If I wanted to see if there was a revaluation, it would be here, which it was applied to. So here is how we paid this invoice. We paid it on 8/1 and entered it on 6/26. And I can see the distributions in here as well. Okay, so that's just how to drill back from the inquiry screen. If I go to transactions by document, let's just switch back here real quick. I also have the option of just looking at work. Work means I have entered the invoice and it's sitting in a batch, but it has not been posted yet. So let's see if there's any of these on this. And hit redisplay. So I have one work document. I have an invoice out there for $50. That's been entered but not posted. I can still go into this and look at it. Okay. If I look at open and redisplay, these are transactions that have yet to be paid, or they've only been partially paid. So in this case, the original invoice was for $657, and we still have $57 outstanding. I can look at this and go to apply, and I can see that we made a payment on this date for $600. So that's sort of how you go back and drill back on your transactions. If I go to transaction by document, it's a little harder to find. You would actually have to know your document numbers, or you can put in a range or a range of document dates. If I knew I entered a transaction on a certain day, but I don't know, I can't remember what the vendor name is, perhaps I could search for it by date. I can also do it by vendor ID, which is very similar to pulling it up by transactions by vendor. Again, you have the same options for drilling back. Purchase order documents is another section. If I want to do a vendor inquiry, and sometimes you've got this vendor inquiry gets me the same information that's on my card, but you may not want to give access to cards to all users. You may want to really restrict who can add new vendors. Then I can go here to the vendor inquiry window, and I can see the information that's in the card without the ability to edit anything. Oh, looks like we're slowing down a little bit. Okay, and then I can see the options. I can see, what the vendor card is, but I can't change anything. So again, just an inquiry screen. Okay, vendor credit, if I'm using credits, I can look at the vendor yearly and see the information here. This is very similar to what we went over earlier because these same windows are available through the vendor card. Going over here to reports, we're kind of winding down on time. On our trial balance reports, we have several options, and this becomes confusing a little bit for users as to which one is the right one to use when you're looking for a report. The age trial balance report, while it gives you print and age as of this date, it will give you the report as of that date, but if any additional, it's still pulling as of the activity that's in the system today. So this is not my preferred method or my preferred form of the report. I have age trial balance with options. If I look at the selections on here, again, I can print an age as of a certain date. And I can also choose to exclude certain types of balances. One is if they have a credit balance. That does still affect your AP balance. I can choose to exclude zero balances. So if the vendor has a zero balance, they just don't show up on the report. If they have no activity, they don't show up on the report. Unposted, applied credit documents, we can exclude those because they're not posted yet. And then multi-currency information. This does change the report, so if you're not using multi-currency, you don't need to include that. I can get a history for just one vendor or a range of vendors or a class of vendors. If you've got those selected, I can also do transaction dates only through a certain date, but still aged as of a certain date. So if you've got email set up in your system, then you can email the reports. I know my email is not set up in this environment, but if I wanted to email this report, then it's going to choose from my Outlook, and then I can just send the aging report to certain Outlook recipients that I've got in my setup. So, and I can create a message as well to go with the document, telling them there's something specific I want them to look at, or here's the report you requested. And this feature of email options runs throughout the system. It doesn't just apply to the AP section. So let's go to the historical age trial balance, which tends to be my default because even yesterday is now historical. So you can run this one for today, you can run it. So if I'm running this for last month end, in this case, we'll pick January 31st, or let's say I want to run it for the calendar year last year, then, and I've got no restrictions. I want to include my credit balances, but exclude all these other options. I'm not going to restrict it by vendor because I want a whole report, and I can send it to the screen. Then I get 12 pages of a vendor payables showing me which invoices are outstanding for each vendor. So this vendor owes us, we owe this vendor $6,700. We've owed them that for a while. These guys are all outstanding for quite some time. And it may be, that I need to go in and clean this up, and we don't really owe them that much money. We've partially paid some of these invoices, so maybe we need to do some write-offs and clean these up. What this shows me here is I had this invoice that was outstanding, and I've paid this payment to it, so I owed them $657, and I've paid them $600. So I've got a balance of $57.68 outstanding on this one invoice, and I need to make a decision as to whether I'm going to pay them or just write it off. Maybe we came to an agreement that we would pay in whole dollars. So that's your report. You would scroll down to the bottom as of 12/31. We owed $1.7 million according to that, and that should tie to my APGL account. If it doesn't, we've got some reconciling to do. Again, I can email that report, I can print it directly, I can print it to the screen and print it. So we'll go ahead and discard that. Any question? I can also, if I know that my settings are correct, I always like to go into modify because I want to check the date, make sure there's no restrictions on the report before I print it. But if I'm confident and I'm the only one who prints these off, and I'm confident of the settings, I can go ahead and print it from here, or I can insert it over here. I can print it, or I could email it if I was set up for the email. Okay. So that's a little bit on inquiries. That's a little bit on the reports. If I wanted check information or needed to reprint posting journals, I can get that information from here. The other super useful, again, is circling back to SmartList just really quick. Not only can I use this to get vendor information and vendor lists, I can get purchasing transaction, payables transaction information if, and this would be similar to doing a vendor inquiry. Let's say I wanted transactions by vendor. Again, this is a default, anything with an asterisk, but I can open up and use it. What I'm gonna do here is I'm going to restrict this to one vendor ID. I'm going to be lazy and not go to the vendor card, but I know that this vendor begins with advanced. I can actually see it right down here, but maybe I don't know what the rest of it is. Let's go ahead and put that in. Okay, and I'm not even going to put in the whole bit. So if I have more than one vendor that starts with advanced, then I'm going to get all of them. And then maybe I'll put a little more effort in and open it up again. So I have 44 payables transactions. I can open this up and see that they're advanced 001, so I can ensure that I'm only pulling the same vendor. Let's say I want to do a pivot table or something out of this, then I can send this to Excel. And whatever I've got on my screen here, it's going to put in the same format, in the same columns into Excel, and I can do with it what I want. I can print it off and send it to someone. This tells me that I had these original document amounts of these numbers here, and the current transaction amounts are right here. So these are what are outstanding. Let's say I want to further reduce this list. I'm going to reopen this, and I'm going to go to current transaction amount, and I'm going to say I only want the ones that are greater than 0. I don't really care about all the ones that are paid. I just really want to know what we owe them. So it pulls up again, refreshes my list, and only gives me the current transaction amount of greater than 0. Now, let's say I've decided that this is a super useful smart list, and I could see using this again, but I don't want to have to go in and make my restrictions again. I'm going to go up here to favorites, and I'm going to call this outstanding vendor transactions. I'm going to go to add and add favorite. It adds it here to my list. So if I go to any other smart list and come back, then I get my same list. I can open this up again next time, and I can change the vendor ID. And it pulls out my outstanding vendor list for another vendor. Okay? If I wanted to actually look at that because I didn't think I owed them anything, then I can open it up. Now, this is interesting to note. This transaction, and this is the difference between running something within GP and here, this also shows unposted transactions. Okay, so that's the transaction we had listed. So I haven't left you a whole lot of time for questions. I did get one question after entering the EFT information for the vendor. Does it go straight to the bank, or is there additional setup involved? Yes, there is additional setup involved. First off, you have to set up the EFT with your bank externally. You have to set up EFT within the system on the bank account in order to be even able to enter that information on the vendor card and what happens at the end. And you can see it right here. You generate an EFT file, and that file is uploaded to your bank. I think there's a way to automate that going directly to your bank once it's generated, but yes, there are additional steps. So we've got a couple more minutes. I know we covered a lot, and I tend to talk pretty fast. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. If you think of something after the presentation today or tomorrow, or you can always contact us afterwards. Any questions? Oh, I see one coming. Hopefully for you guys, SmartList will become your best friend. I know for me, it's one of my favorite tools within GP, not only for the Payables module, but for every other module as well. And once you learn to play with it, you'll find it super helpful. Okay, so we have a question about positive pay. There is a way to set up positive pay within the system. Positive pay, for those of you not familiar, is it's called Safe Pay in GP. You'll see it right here. And what this does is you configure the file to the bank's specifications, and it allows you to send the bank a list of valid checks. It also includes voids. In that file, and you upload it directly to the bank and let them know which checks, including date, payee, and amount, are valid for your organization. So yes, that is absolutely possible within GP. So with that, if there's no other questions, I know we're right at the very end. It's been great working with you today, and we look forward to seeing you next month for the next class. Oh, and just one note, Shireen did point out, depending on your configuration and your licensing, this may be a separate module, and it may be included. We would have to look into whether you would need to purchase that module or whether you've got it included. So I look forward to talking to you all next month. Thanks so much.